Only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to our event today. We're really excited to be here with you, and I'm going to record this so that those who were unable to join us can join. I'm starting that now. So I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for taking some time out of your day to spend with us. You can see several of us here on your screen today if you're joining us live with video. And my name is Bonnie Bright. Some of you know me. My name, I guess you know my name. I just said it. And you can see our names on the screen also. I know some of you will be listening by phone, and so we'll try to do our best to sort of say who is talking or say who we are as we go through. So just a reminder to the panelists, if you would try to remember to mention your name when you start talking. It's hard when we're on video and we can see each other. We kind of forget that not everybody can see us, but. I'm really grateful to the board members that are here with me today. You can see them on your screen there. We have Eva Ryder, starting from the left there, followed by James Newell, Craig Chalquist, Brent Potter, and Donna May. And we may have some others joining us eventually, but other members that are not able to be here at this moment are Mark Sipowicz, Michael Bogar, Linda Ravenswood, Dorene Mahoney, and Gary Bobroff. So you can see all of our bios if you go to the About tab on the homepage of the Alliance. So you can read us.
Don't forget Jesse is here too.
Oh, Jesse, thank you. See, there you go. Out of sight, out of mind. So I'm sorry. So Jesse Masterson is with us. We only have space for 6 cameras, so we're going to kind of turn off and turn on as we can to accommodate everybody. But Jesse, thank you so much for joining us, and we're glad to have you with us too. So to start this off, we are anticipating a really rich discussion, and it's my hope that you guys as board members can kind of bounce off of each other and really just have that dialogue. We've actually been having a very rich dialogue offline in a private site on the Alliance recently over a lot of different things that are going on, and particularly about the role of depth psychology in the world today. And we just feel that there's so much here that we can bring to the community, and that this can really become a community initiative to discuss what the evolution of depth psychology is, if it's evolving, and if it should be evolving, and what kind of role it might play for each of us, and if it's different from the clinical side or clinical application of things to the cultural or the more activist kind of application of things. So there's a lot to talk about. It goes without saying, I'm sure most of you who are listening to this are aware of some events that have happened this week, in particular in Charleston, South Carolina, with this really horrific shooting that took place at a church, and the youthfulness of the shooter, and just the entire scenario was so very devastating, and of course it's one of many events that have just been heartbreaking that we've seen happening in recent months and years, and so I think we're all aware that there is definitely something going on in our culture that's not quite right. We're out of balance as depth psychology would look at it, and something needs to be brought in that can help us to resume the balance that is inherently there. So I'd like to start by just reading a quote, and then I will invite board members to just jump in and start talking. Rather than maybe going in order and having you each say something, why don't we just kind of do popcorn style? And at the same time, I wanted to invite everybody who's listening, if you're listening live, to go on to depthpsychologyalliance.com, and we do have the chat function going there. So you can find that by clicking on the chat link at the top of the page, or if you look down at the bottom, there's a tab that says Main Room. And if you click on that to open it up, you'll see that, and you can participate there. You can ask questions. We'll try to monitor those. As well, in this particular space, if you want to ask a question, you can type it in. You should see a little box there on your screen where you can type it in. Or we'd love to hear your voices, so you can always raise your hand. You have a virtual hand, so you'll see an icon there with a hand on it. If you click that and put it up, we'll see you and I can call on you. So please, we'd like to really open this to the community. We intend for this to be an ongoing conversation, and Depth Psychology Alliance is a place where we want this conversation to be taking place because we feel it's so important. So let's go from there. So I'm going to start with this quote. This comes from Jung, and it's from Civilization in Transition. And he says, "The gigantic catastrophes that threaten us today are not elemental happenings of a physical or biological order, but psychic events. To a terrifying degree, a quite terrifying degree, we are threatened by wars and revolutions which are nothing other than psychic epidemics. At any moment, several millions of human beings may be smitten with a new madness, and then we shall have another world war or devastating revolution. Instead of being at the mercy of wild beasts, earthquakes, landslides, and inundations, modern man is battered by the elemental forces of his own psyche. So this was the one place that Jung was coming from, and obviously for him, depth psychology was an antidote for that on some level. So with that, let's just jump in, and maybe for the first question, if you can each just say a few words about your response to that, or if you have something else on your mind, go ahead. Would it be easier if I call on you guys? You want to raise your hand so I can see you?
I can jump in if no one else wants to.
Thank you, James.
Of course, I resonate a lot with the quote from Jung, and the whole idea that the events are psychic events, and particularly as you know from my conversations with you all, I'm interested in the sort of cultural mythology of I don't like to call it the national mythology, but it really is. The cultural mythology and national mythology of the United States. And I think something that's needed is that we rewrite the origin story. When you get into sacred renewal, ancient peoples always knew that there was going to be periods of foulness and emptiness, and when that happened, you would go into rites of renewal, and you go into rites of mourning when big events happened, and then there would be a rite of renewal. And in order to do that, they'd go back to the origin myths. And the origin myth of the United States is really, we're finding more and more and more not functioning. We weren't really just heroic people who came across the waters and found this barren land and made a go of it. And as a matter of fact, it turned out that we stole the land from other people, genocidally murdered them, and then built the economy on the backs of Africans who were stolen from their lands. Literally millions died just getting over here. 15 million or more were brought here before it was outlawed, and then they were just kind of kept like livestock and bred to be. So this is a cause for mourning. This is not a cause for celebration, and this is not integrated into our national myth. And I think it needs to be, our national origin story needs to include that, and needs to be mourned. And I mean, one thing I think of is, instead of lighting fireworks at 4th of July, that we have rites of mourning where we realize that we're free today because of the deaths of all these native people and all these African people. And when that is more integrated, which is a big order, but that's the kind of level, I think, on which I like to think of all these events, because I'm very interested in the whole history of this very symbolic act of this wasn't just a black church in Charleston. This is the AME Emmanuel Church, which goes back to one of the first slavery revolts before the Civil War, and it just has a rich history for all African Americans, and it's just it's symbolic on so many levels. So there's a lot. Charleston itself was 40% of the slaves who were imported into the United States came through Charleston. So it's I don't think it's an accident that I mean, certainly wasn't planned by this individual, but I mean the psychic energy in this area. I live in South Carolina, so I'm feeling it kind of on a visceral level. It's there's a lot of symbolism going on. It's getting. That's symbolic too.
Bear with us, everyone.
Wow.
Anyways, that's pretty much what I have. I have a lot more to say. So much for no electronic problems coming up.
Hold on 1 second, everyone. Just wait 1 second. All right. I'm just going through and unmuting, muting everybody so that we can take care of that sound. So if you can just bear with us for 1 second. This rarely happens, but when you get a group of this many on, sometimes it can happen. So, okay, all of our panelists should be back unmuted. So, and I wanted to welcome Michael Bogar, who is on our board and has been able to join us also. Welcome, Michael.
So, obviously the role of racism in this is central, and racism in American slavery, there always was slavery, but racism in American slavery was actually a technique that that happened that didn't happen elsewhere, and until we can rewrite that origin story and kind of integrate all that, the really virulence of racism is going to continue, I think. Anyways, those are my thoughts on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, is my view of one of the roles that depth psychology can play in this kind of event.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe if it's easier, what we could do is just go around. I know it. This is not something that's easy necessarily to articulate. And you mentioned the need for mourning or grieving, James, which I think is such a critical aspect of depth psychology, because it allows space for holding the tension between not just jumping in and trying to fix something necessarily, but also allowing that space in which we hold the shadow and we honor and we witness something. We become more engaged in the event by witnessing and holding it than just trying to move on so quickly. So for me, depth psychology is so powerful. And part of the problem, I think, too, is what, as you mentioned, we've talked about this before, is the idea of soul loss, which a lot of earth-based peoples have as a concept in their culture, and the idea that we have really lost our connection to something greater, something deeper, something more sacred. Things aren't holy anymore, and Jung talks about that quite frequently in his work, that we have lost that connection to something bigger than ourselves. And so depth psychology for me is a way to come back into some kind of relationship with that sacred and that sense of when we need to be able to hold things and not jumping into things too quickly. And so how do we, in a culture where we are so quick to try to fix things, or so quick to kind of I think on some level it's because we have such an achiever mindset, particularly in the United States. And I know there are people outside the U.S. that are listening to this, but how do you guys think? Let's just go through one at a time, maybe. And Eva, we'll start with you, and we'll just move across the screen.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of things coming up in response to what James was saying. I mean, and I agree, absolutely. I mean, this is our shadow. It's our shadow, but it's also the shadow of humanity. I mean, we are also perpetrating this all over the world. And I've recently been watching Ken Burns' program on the Roosevelts, and I was really struck by Theodore Roosevelt. He was driven, and I mean, he had this crazed, he loved hunting bears, for instance. And his entire house was covered with heads of animals. From, I don't even know how his family could tolerate it, actually. And he started this imperialism, and he saw this opening because the British Empire had fallen, and said, let's create an empire. And we want to be the mighty. We want to take over. I mean, so it all started way back with him. Actually, before that, of course, with Thomas Jefferson holding his slaves until after he died. So all of this is part of our history, and we are also the children of an British Empire and immigrants, people who have fled from other places because of persecution. So this is actually a human problem, and it's a problem of the patriarchy. Mm-hmm. This kind of power over dynamic that we're seeing everywhere.
So yeah,
it's gone too far.
Thank you, Eva. So the question is, what's the role of depth psychology? Can depth psychology do something about that, or are we just essentially out of luck because that's the way the culture is? Craig, do you want to weigh in on that?
I really like how the conversation in depth psychology has evolved over the years. When I first began studying it, there was a lot of reduction of cultural disasters, realities, to archetypes, and then it just sat there, and there wasn't much capacity at that time, except among a few practitioners, to hold the social and the cultural with the archetypal. So I'm glad we're actually doing that in this discussion. One thing I appreciate too about depth psychology is the constant need for self-examination. And when you had, Bonnie, when you had emailed us about how we might reimagine our field, the first thing that came to my mind was diversity. And we are moving forward with that. When I was a student at Pacifica Graduate Institute, there was one person of color in my whole class, and in some classes there were none. And now it's very different. They've really been moving in that direction well and are continuing to. So I think all of depth psychology ought to be taking that on too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Brent, what's resonating for you in all of this? You're on mute still. Sorry. Oh, you know what? I apologize, Brent. I had muted everybody and I did not unmute you. There we go. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, I resonate with James. I think it's important to go back and kind of find a fitting narration for American beginnings. And for me, when the event occurred, what I was thinking from a depth psychology question, and I think one of the areas that psychoanalysis is so important is that we are okay with opening up a space for a question and then associating to it. We hopefully aren't addicted to certitude. And so we can open up a space and ask, I mean, one depth psychology question would be, how is this gentleman a symptom, a cultural symptom? What's going on? And kind of because this isn't the first, and it certainly won't be the last incident of this sort. And one of the associations I had that's really kind of stuck with me, especially from my first book, was Jonathan, I think his name's Jonathan Shea, wrote Achilles in Vietnam, where he talks about a dynamic that occurs that has three parts. The first part is violation of Themis, Themis, and that was the Greek goddess of natural order, that things happen naturally, kind of the rules of nature, the laws of nature. And in his work, a violation of Themis is something that's catastrophic or beyond catastrophic that happens to someone. That can be developmental stress or trauma. A violation somehow of natural order in relational or psychic reality. And then the second thing that he talks about is frozen grief as a result of that, an inability to move past or to work through or to grow beyond a traumatized or a stressful state. And then, you know, as I think about this person who committed that act, and also us as a country, I wonder in the back of my mind about these things, especially in light of having a history behind us that James aptly points out. And then the third is after you have violation of Themis and frozen grief, sustained, unremitting, the third thing is berserking, where that would be acting out in a very violent fashion. And the violence he talks about has a peculiar power to it because it's so linked to the archetype. And he chose the word berserking. I won't go into the history of that and bore you, but basically it means that you're very much attuned to the daimon of complete and abject destruction. So it's that immortal figure sort of merging with the mortal, and that is where the most violent violence comes from. So those are kind of my associations to the question, and I think that more importantly, the depth psychology question may be, how is this incident a cultural symptom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. Thank you so much, Brent. I just want to insert myself just for a second here, Donna, before you go, and read a comment from one of our listeners. Satya says this, and I thought it was very insightful, which maybe not news, but very insightful. And they write, though the news is relevant and in our faces, yesterday's news is today's news and tomorrow's news, viewed in overview. Perhaps the vertical depths and heights of psyche are now being pushed further open to be accessed, as I gather is the subject of this discussion, among other things, and it seems, and what this relates to me is the terra incognito beyond our depth psychology jargon, and even much deeper than talk therapy. The somatics of our soul-body embodiment is, in my experience, needs to be activated beyond conversation, catharsis, physical action married to mind awareness, etc., are what I see as a necessity for the future of depth psychology, along with the work that is now going on. So thank you so much for that, Satya. I just really wanted to honor that, that call for and that reminder for embodiment, because this is something that we have lost so deeply, and part of it is our lack of connection with the earth, and our lack of reminder or understanding that absolutely every single thing that we get comes from the earth. But it's also this head-centered space that, again, our culture seems to be so embedded in. And it's not just technology, because that's not the problem. The problem is the way that we think and we use things, and that we are out of touch with our bodies in a tremendous way. So thank you. Donna, what's going on for you with all of this? Donna, sorry, you are muted, and I don't know if it's on your end. Yeah, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? There we go.
Sorry about that. Well, first, I just wanted to thank you for reading that comment by Sasha. I thought that was very rich and powerful. And for me, depth psychology, the very words speak to soul and going down. So that connection with the earth and how important that is. And often what I think traditional psychology or just the culture at large we're up in our head, and it's an intellectual exercise. And one of the things that I think depth psychology can bring to the conversation has to do with the ability to bring, as James, I resonate with what you had to say, a new story or a deepening story that encompasses all of the different individuals and their experience, and that we come together and begin to start to honor the diversity of story, and have a space where we can come together and tell those stories in a place of respect and honoring. And I think our overculture doesn't do that at all. And I think that what depth psychology can do is ask us to come together in circle and story and connect both with the stories of the earth, also with the indigenous people who are so connected to their place and were displaced and or have been traumatized multi-generationally, as the people that came over on the boats, the Africans, and also the Irish and the other people that came here that were enslaved, as well as people like my ancestors, who I think were forced over here because of whatever was being pushed, the Irish and the others pushed off of their land. And as trauma recycles and recreates trauma, unless we can come together and tell stories. And as James, I loved your idea of coming together so we can grieve together, celebrate together, and to start to imagine a different way to be together on not only this country, but on the earth. But definitely this country has like a deep-seated amount of wounds. And I think, Ava, you mentioned about the shadow. You know, story and coming together can help us find a place where we can start to tell the truth, all the truth. And that is part of what depth psychology is for me, is we start rooted in the realities of things and honoring those things, crying over those things. So there's a place to kind of move forward in a genuine way rather than an artificial way.
Yeah.
So
authenticity.
What that means.
Thank you so much, Donna. I think you're pointing to something really critical. And this is interesting because you're actually Satya, who I just read her or his. I'm sorry, I don't know which it is, but I read their comment a minute ago, and they go on to say, to add something which I think is related to what you're saying, And they say, in other words, psyche as a whole is calling on us as depth psychologists to move beyond viewing the whole from its parts. It's not enough. A more creative approach that includes but is not based on academics is being called forth, in my opinion. So, this is exactly right. It's about the embodiment, and it's about being involved together as a tribe. And it's about doing more than just talking about it. We're doing what we can here to talk about it, but we've had a lot of discussion among our small group as well, of board members, about depth psychology as a movement. And what would that look like, as opposed to just a field? They're very different constructions if you think about it from that standpoint, and very different dynamics, quite frankly. And so we've talked about what that might mean and how that might look, and how we can actually expand an organization like Depth Psychology Alliance from being an academic site, but to more of an activist site, where there can be more opportunities for small discussions, out of which some kind of collaboration and some kind of activity can arise that can be transformative. So I'd love to hear more about what you guys are thinking about that. Before I go on and we talk to those who are not on camera right now, and I'm going to turn my camera off in just a second. We have still waiting Jesse and Michael from the board, and also Gary's joined us a few minutes ago, so welcome to you guys. But I want to call on, there's somebody who's raised their hand, and I don't know how to pronounce your name. It looks like Kaija. So you can correct me on how that is. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you can tell us how to pronounce your name, and then if you want to make your comment or question, that would be great. Go ahead. We can hear you. I mean, we should be able to hear you. You are unmuted. And I saw you unmute yourself, but I'm not hearing you talking. All right. There may be a problem with the microphone. We should be able to hear you. Okay. All right. Well, we can try again in a minute if you want to fiddle with your microphone and see if it makes a difference. And if anyone else would like to add their voice to this conversation, please do so. And I wanted to just acknowledge those of you who are chatting on Depth Psychology Alliance on the homepage there. Skip, thank you. Holly, you're always there present. Thank you so much. And Zach, you guys are having a great conversation over there on the side. So please go and take a look at that when you have a chance. And we'll leave that up, by the way, for a few hours for the rest of today, so that everybody else can go read that if you don't want to distract yourself right now. So I'm going to turn my camera off, and let's move to Jesse. If you guys wouldn't mind turning your cameras on so we can see you while you talk, if that's a possibility. Jesse, I'm just wondering what's resonating for you right now in all of this, and what you're thinking about. You've been such an amazing, strong voice in our offline discussion, which I'm hoping you can bring to us here today about some of your thoughts. I'm not hearing Jesse. Yeah, Jesse's unmuted. So Jesse, we'll come back to you in just a minute. I see his microphone just went off completely. So there's some kind of an issue going on there. Maybe we can move on to Michael. So Michael, if you wanted to just say a few words and just share some of your thoughts about all of this, the role of depth psychology in the world today, and where we might be going with it. Go ahead, Michael. Michael, can you hear us? There we go.
Now it looks like I'm...
Yeah. Yes. Go ahead. We can hear you.
You can hear me? I'm actually on the webcam, but I don't know how to turn it on.
You might see a small icon to the right, or actually, for me, it's on the right. It's a little icon that has a picture of a camera on there. So, and Gary, if you'd like to turn yours on too, that'd be great, because of course we're going to you next.
Little picture. Oh, is that it? Anyway.
There we are. We see you. Great.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank
you are.
Thanks for showing up.
Oh, my hair. Okay. Well, hi. It's interesting to actually be on the webcam. So I didn't hear all of the conversation, but I did hear part of it, and I guess my 2 cents worth is, in the time I was at Pacifica, 3 years at Pacifica, I found that that a lot of the insights from the depth psychological perspective were driven by ideology, which is understandable, right? But I didn't find a whole lot of Republicans or libertarians, which is more where I lean, at Pacifica. So it made for a very interesting kind of conversation around some of these issues, because I found sometimes that the conversation was driven by assumptions. I mean, I spent 4 years in a seminary, and there I found that the more conservative position, their ideology determined how they interpreted the myth. And then when I got to Pacifica, I found the same thing going on from a more progressive or liberal perspective. So I found it fascinating that the mythology, whether it was biblical or Greek or Native American or whatever, was driven by ideology a lot of the time, but it was never discussed. And I think part of the discussion needs to be around that issue right there, that our ideologies are much more involved in our depth psychological interpretation of these myths than I think we often either recognize or will talk about.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's my
good points, and thank you for persisting with your camera, Michael. It's really good to see you, and Gary, you too.
Yeah.
It looks like Jesse might be back. Let's go to Gary first, since we have you here live, and then we'll go to Jesse right after that. And then I do have a couple of comments also from our audience I'd like to bring in. So, Gary, go ahead. What's on your mind at the moment?
Hi. Well, I don't have much to say really. I do archetypal work on the sort of the background of our political beliefs, so that's a big part of what I do, and I just want to pass it along to the next person. I know there's a lot of people that want to get in here, so let's just bring on the next.
Great, thank you. Thanks for joining us, Gary. So appreciate your support. Gary's one of our new board members. We've just added him, and we're really happy to have him on the board with us. So thank you, Gary. If you want to turn your camera off, we'll get Jesse. I know you're probably welcoming that. We'll get Jesse on there if we can do that. Jesse, I hope we can hear you now. I think we can.
Hopefully
Yes.
now. I turned my mute off. I forgot to unmute last time. For me, it's with so much of the education that I've had and the professional work, there is and it's part of the discussion that's going on, is there somebody what is the typical person that is in depth psychology, working with depth psychology? What is the diversity of depth psychology itself? And that's one of the questions I have, is how do we do a deep, thoughtful, internal look at depth psychology? And then how do we broaden or do some things differently so that maybe even we're going back to some of our roots with Adler's free clinics. How do we work with people that aren't the typical? And in the U.S., I will go out on a limb and say my experience has been it's fairly middle-class white, and that's not everybody. But in looking at who's writing in the journals, who is doing the research, there is a predominant number that I see that would be middle-class white. How do we reach out? How do we diversify what it is that we're doing? And if we want this to be more of a movement, if we want to be more working with all types of people, how do we do that deep look first internally at depth psychology and say, well, who are we and what are we doing and where do we need to be going?
Yeah, very
thought.
good point. Jung always talked about how the work has to begin with the individual first. And, as we know, that's where it all begins. If we can't bring ourselves into balance, like the story of the Rainmaker, which so many of you are familiar with, that Jung was told by Richard Wilhelm, if we can't bring ourselves into some kind of Tao or some kind of balance, then we really don't have the opportunity to allow that for the outside world on some level. Thank you.
Right, and also looking at depth psychology as a unified body, depth psychology as an individual.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Because it is in one way.
Can you say a little bit more about that, Jesse?
Well, I'm thinking of group field theory. Whenever there's a group field, it takes on a life of its own, which is separate and not separate from the individuals who make up the group. So you have depth psychology and you could look at depth psychology in the U.S. as a group field, and as a group field, it stands as a unified unit. And how do you look at that depth psychology as a body, separate from the individuals who make it up? It contains them, but it is also still an entity of itself.
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Yes. Thank you. Just for the board, if anybody wants to jump in and respond to each other, that's fine.
Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah, I'm thinking too that, we talk a lot about how we're thinking, but we're really very much a sensate culture, this a very extroverted sensate culture, and this was something that Jung was pointed out when he came to the United States the first time, and is really evident when you travel the world how extroverted we are. So we don't tend to self-reflect. In response to some of what Jesse was saying just now, I think I've been noticing in my own private practice, because I see a lot of students, that they're not necessarily, I see a confluence of races and cultures now, and of course I'm seeing university students, but they're asking questions. Because they're struggling with these gigantic loans, they're struggling with what is ahead of them as young people, and the ecological crisis and the financial crisis. I think that they're carrying a very heavy burden right now. And they are coming to depth psychology because there's no other choice, and that's when we do come to a place where we're on our knees or on our faces, because what is the future? And it brings us back to our roots, I think. So that brings in, again, the shadow of the feminine, that which is the earth and is our bodies. And what I think you said, Sachi had mentioned, I think was really, really important, Bonnie. How do we bring this to ground? How do we bring this into our daily lives? Because we as a group tend to speak so much from our minds, but there's this shadow of the feminine that is always there, always haunting us. It is that is soul. Psyche is soul. And psychology, modern psychology, has lost that. So I think perhaps that's the most important aspect of depth psychology. If it is, we're no longer dealing with just psychology, are we? I mean, it's, or even just ideology.
Yeah, it's gone beyond that.
Yes.
Anyone else want to say something? I do have a hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the audience and call on J. Paul. J. Paul, I'm unmuting you now, so we'd love to hear from you. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Very good discussion. I really enjoy this, and I really resonate with James's original getting back to the origin. My question is kind of academic, but I think moving from academic to activism would be a movement from theory to practice, and so we might be looking at best case practices or best case studies for what would be the best case studies for depth psychology, but and start to identify where in the field we can use depth psychology. But the question I have is, how deep is depth? What are the dimensions, the dynamics of depth in terms of a bigger history for the continent? I totally agree with that. We need to get back to the depth of origins. In a sense, it's asking, how wide or how large is the soul? And I do certainly agree this is, but I think soul may even be deeper than race and gender. Soul, I think, Thomas Berry speaks about it in terms of our historic mission now is to reimagine and reinvent even the human species. We're at a critical time for reinvention of the human species, and there's a lot there, but I really resonate with that, getting to a new origin story.
That's beautiful. I haven't heard that, and I've read quite a lot of Thomas Berry, but the idea of reinventing the human species, I think, is one that's starting to emerge on some level. People are calling it different things. They're talking about a collective consciousness that's growing, and a big shift in that consciousness, which I think is starting to happen. And I think those of us who are working depth psychology or letting it work us, as the case may be, are really at the groundswell of that. And as long as we're doing the work, as it's been pointed out, on ourselves, that is something that it's almost contagious, right? It sort of grows and evolves in that way. But I think actually, Brent, you said something this week in our offline discussion that was really, I thought, an amazing idea, and not one I had thought of. And it was about how Jung talks about the second half of life. Most of you are probably familiar with that, and how adults sort of, once we get our early stages of adulthood taken care of, we have jobs, careers, work that we can do, families, income is taken, etc. Then something changes, and we start looking for the spiritual things. And so I know, Brent, you had mentioned that maybe this is what's happening for depth psychology. I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, to answer the first, well, not really to answer, but to just a brief elaboration on, I'm not sure what was just said. I'm not sure if it's a matter of finding a new story or a new kind of origin, but perhaps sticking with the meaning and ground phenomena and history that we already have. If we just knew what and expressed our original, like Joseph Campbell always said that. He said, people would ask, where are the new myths coming from? And he was like, well, you don't need new myths. You need to stick with the original myths and the values and the ethos and things like that therein. Concerning the first half, second half of life sort of stuff I've been thinking about is that it's certainly not limited to Jungian psychology, but I've noticed there's a certain irony to Jungian psychology sticking in the first half of life in terms of a lot of its practices, what the rules are, who we are, who everyone else is. And kind of the first half of life task, like real briefly, is basically forging, polishing the ego. It focuses on the container, and then hopefully if a person, an organization, a group, something is on track, then we mature more into second half of life, which has to do with what are the contents of the container. What do the rules mean to me? What does it mean that I come from this tradition of depth psychology? What's the next indicated step to sort of take this? And it's not just even within the field of psychology. I mean, this seems to be kind of a cultural phenomenon that James Hillman pointed out with American, that we're perpetually doing the first half of life over and over and over again, as if doing that more and more makes it more okay or more real, kind of stuck, fixated, frozen in this adolescent mentality, teenage worship, child worship. To be beautiful means to look young. I mean, the list goes. At the adolescent male kind of belligerent attitude and proclivity for guns in warfare. So I think that there's a real urgency to look at second half of life stuff, which means, what does all this mean to us? Where are we going? And to do so with an attention to reality, which has to do with subtlety, paradox, irony, to move past, as Michael was saying, kind of the either-or thinking into both and thinking, conservative, totally conservative, or totally liberal, that reality tends to get into both and, where we can't really be on one side or another if we're going to stick with the phenomenon itself. That's what I think.
Or if we are, at least admit it.
Yeah.
I mean,
honesty is a good start.
Right, exactly. But if if we have a position, I think it's good to admit it and say, this is going to affect the way I read this myth, or approach psyche.
That's the phenomenological attitude, is to recognize to the best of our ability our philosophical presuppositions and to hold those in check. Yeah.
Right, and when Hillman basically took over at the Jung Institute, I mean, he really tried to clean house of all these so-called.
He hardly agrees.
That. I mean, he really tried to get people to start revisioning psychology and go, use Jung's methodology rather than his, so-called psychological system. And I think sometimes we get stuck in sort of perpetuating the assumed truths about psyche that Jung found, and he never said that it was the truth. I mean, if it's the depths, it's impossible to nail it down and say, This is, I mean, even depth psychology. We talked last time, I think, about looking at some different kind of terminology. Instead of depth psychology, when I say that in class, when I use that terminology in classes, most people just go, and we have to spend 2 or 3 hours just talking about that, and at the end of that, they don't really fully understand it.
Yeah, it's a good point. This brings us back to Jay Paul's question or comment, and that is, how deep is depth? What does that really mean? And can it be? We've talked a lot about this. Can it be defined, and can it even be ever completely known? When I tell people that I do depth psychology and they say, what is it? I say, well, it's basically the study of the unknowable. If it's unknowable, how do you even begin to study it, let alone to talk about it and define it? And I have a colleague who we've been doing some work together, who was asking in a small group we did the other day. Our depth psychology is a vocation group that we're piloting online right now. Some of you are a part of that. She was asking, how do we take something like this into, say, the corporate world or into even nonprofit organizations? How can we, as depth psychologists, sort of explain or articulate what it is that we're doing so that we can then bring the value of what we have to them? And we don't even have that beginning, because how do you articulate it? I mean, that becomes so difficult. So the question is, do we just rename it? Is that going to solve the issue, or...
Remarketed.
Rebranded.
Right.
Yeah.
So what would some of you say about what different terminology might be used for depth psychology? I mean, label-wise, as horrible as that sounds.
I think, I don't want to speak for him, but I think Gary has a lot to say about that, and I really resonated with something he said on an earlier talk, which is that it's all of this process, in its best, is to name and follow a natural process. This is a natural process that we're going through. Depth psychology should not be an invention. It should be an observation and a stewarding of a natural process. And Gary may want to say more about that. I mean, I'm not putting words in your mouth. That's my take on it.
Oh, that was great. That was great. Yeah, that was great. I mean, I think that's the whole thing here, is any time that we're getting, I mean, we can laugh and say, oh, rebranding, but boy, we all want to make a living, and that's what we do, and we do have something natural here, and if the language and the terminology isn't helping us to connect with people, then the language and the terminology should be the first thing we throw overboard. It really is about branding, and it is about what words do we use. And I, like I said last time in our board meeting, this is something that's natural. It's in us. It should feel like that, and to me it does. Depth psychology feels, Jung's insight hit me on the inside. It's like seeing the bone structure underneath something. It's natural. It's not theoretical for me. So I think it should click. Jung always would say that. That's when it clicked. So these things should click. So whatever that means for each of us, taking the ball and running with it in our own way. But yeah, it's natural, and whatever words and language we use. James Hillman had the Soul's Code, and you could call that a sellout or whatever, but it was one of his most popular books and got people talking that language again. So whatever it is that we can do that is of service, I think that's a great way to go.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there has to be different tracks where we can actually sort of guide people down a pathway to provide it some kind of a structure or framework that allows them to ease into it carefully. So, obviously each of us here, and probably almost everybody listening, has their own opinion of what depth psychology is, and probably has a pretty good understanding of the terminology and articulating. We're still struggling, but we maybe need to have just sort of a beginner's some articulation that would allow us to reach people, to touch people, to reach out to them, and not just not what language does best when it's used best, I think, is to actually create emotion, right? To create some kind of connection with the individual. So I don't know what that looks like. I wanted to read, we have so many good comments and questions coming in by writing. Mm-hmm. Thank you guys so much for this, and also lots of amazing discussion going on. I keep looking over here because that's where my other screen is, and I can see that, but definitely please take a few moments to read that later if you're not reading it now. The discussion chat on the Depth Psychology Alliance homepage. John, thank you so much. Good to see you, John. Here's the comment that he actually posted several minutes ago before we kind of moved into this vein, which is quite relative, I think. He says, our modern culture does not lack depth. In what way is depth commonly understood today? In what way is depth counted as knowledge and taught around which cultural practices are formed and maintained? In two ways. Space, we talk about the depth of space, outer space, inner space, microphysics, and time, the depth of history. The difficulty is not that we lack an understanding and knowledge of depth today. The difficulty is that our current understanding of depth lies in its purely positivistic interpretation. The difficulty is that this particular interpretation cannot see or allow any other understandings of depth. It locks us into an only positivistic understanding of reality. It shuts out, for example, a psychological understanding of depth. Our origins are entirely understood in temporal, spatial, i.e. positivistic terms. This is a modern interpretation of depth. How does that hit you guys? Can you relate? What about when you teach it? Craig, I know you're teaching in an institution that does have definitely a focus on depth and a lot of spiritual type of qualities. Do you find that you're getting students who already are prepared to discuss this, and what is the level or extent of their preparedness if you start talking about it right away?
Yeah, it's all over the place, actually. We have some classes where they've had quite a background in it, and others where they don't know anything about it and they're beginners. And sometimes when I'm talking about my understanding of what depth psychology is, I try to go by where they are with it. And sometimes I make it very simple and say we're interested in assembling practices and insights and knowledge and literature about what happens when conscious meets unconscious. And then at other times, when I'm teaching a group that's more interested in social transformation, I might draw on something that Mary Watkins taught me. This is my language, not hers, but it's her idea about welcoming in what's been pushed to the margins of culture and consciousness. So I do it different ways for different people, but I do always try to keep in that element of letting in what's been cast out and linking that directly to the psyche as my own way of operating on it. But yeah, they're all over the place. Pacifica asked me to show up and speak about being an alum at an event, and I was joking with the audience that sometimes when I tell people I'm a depth psychologist, they say a death psychologist, like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and funerals and all that. And I'm like, no, well, that's an aspect of it, Ask Hillman, but
yeah.
So that's my
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else was getting that. Craig, I'm having some clicking kind of happening while you're talking. I think it's something with your microphone, so maybe you can try to adjust it. It was fine. I could hear you. It just happened to coincide exactly with everything you were talking. Yeah, thank you. Ginger is reminding me on the questions here that Hillman called for a new language, in quotes, a new language altogether in one of his last and final talks at Pacifica.
Mm-hmm. Depth. Are we talking about depth? Depth. Sometimes in the class, I will just ask people to go home and watch a movie like The Beaver. I don't know if it didn't make a big splash, but Jodie Foster and Mel Gibson made a movie about 3 years ago called The Beaver, which is the most depth psychological movie I have ever seen in my life. Anybody else seen that?
Mm-mm.
No? Wow.
I will now.
Yeah. I mean, Mel Gibson wasn't real popular at the box office back then, but Jodie Foster called him and said, this is a movie about a man who is successful, clinically depressed, drinking too much, losing his family, and he needs to find a way back to sanity. And he finds a beaver in the garbage can, a puppet, and that beaver he wears it on his hand, and it speaks a voice that he didn't even know he had. And it takes you through this literally roller coaster ride of therapy through a puppet. So it's fascinating. And people will come back, and in fact, we did a whole weekend retreat on just that movie We watched it on Friday night and then spent the whole weekend talking about depth psychology because all the ideas are in the movie. And same thing with The Wizard of Oz, of course. You know, you've got the whole depth psychological perspective there. So I think the tools are out there. It's just a matter of finding them and finding what catches the heart and minds of this culture.
Yeah, very good point. Does somebody want to respond to that, or I have a comment?
Just to add to it, I really like that way of holding it, and I would add as part of that, would be a right way of saying it, I don't know, reaching out to culture, the dimension of story, which in my experience in school didn't get a whole lot of space. And we heard a lot about interpretations and not much about how to actually tell a story. Donna's work addresses that directly. So it'd be nice to have some really effective training in storytelling happening.
Yeah.
And maybe an openness to different ways of interpreting the material, and also what Michael was talking about, you know, an openness to, so what ideology do you bring to this, and where are you coming from with that? And that would be nice. Young Upton talked about how a symbol, to put it in my own language, is different from a sign in that it's open to multiple perspectives. And when we try to nail it down to one ideology, whether it's stated or not, it tends to kill it, turn it into a sign, you know. So storytelling can be a really great invitation. Donna, you can say much more about this if you want to, into that kind of deep work.
Was that a pass or?
No. I'm muting my mic because I'm not on earphones. But I am swimming in the power of story and community storytelling. I just had our first event based on the Mark Yaconelli's work at the Hearth in Ashland, Oregon, and he's like a mentor, and we brought it to my area. And basically, the power is in the experience. I mean, and that's where I live, where I do my work, is when people can have an experience and connect with one another and with themselves at the same time. And it went really well, I thought. And the piece of what storytelling does is when people come together in community and they tell a personal story from the heart. In other words, it's not like performance theater or acting, you know, a presentation. It's more of, this is who I am, and this is one piece of who I am. And people come and they listen to the story with respect. There's something very powerful that happens that is alchemical. You know, talk about depth psych. I mean, it's an alchemical experience that happens in the room when people are, and it's the listener and the story both are an extremely powerful part of that. And I think that, anyway, I could go on and on, but thank you, Craig, for the invitation to speak to that, because this is where people can begin to come together and have an experience where it's connected mind, body, and spirit, and it allows for the diversity of experience.
Yeah.
And it's non-judging. It's not judging. It's not coming from a place of we're going to preach about something that comes from the head. It's about coming from the heart and honoring the community and in all its ways. And here, that includes both mostly white. I'm in a very rural area, but there's also a lot of Native Americans here that hold a lot of trauma and pain. And so it's a way to come together and bring community together. And where there's divisions, when people sit down and honestly listen to one another, it makes us, here's another terminology, right? I think it asks us to be human with one another. It asks us to hold and claim our own projections and shadow and not project it out on other people. And those are just a few pieces of it, but it was a really beautiful thing to witness. I've seen it many times in different forms, but this was my first attempt in a huge community setting, right, to bring together very diverse members of the community together in that way. And so I'm going to do more of that, and also I think also marginalized people that do not get to they don't get to tell their story, and nobody listens to it. This is a very powerful piece that I think is pertinent to our conversation of what has been happening here the last week, is that when we marginalize people and don't think, we're just thinking in terms of something that's not based in heart, it's based in something else, then we get these tragic events. And when people come together in these ways, it's just more powerful. I know I'm rambling, but the other place where this can help with marginalized people is like I'm getting ready to go back into juvenile hall again, which I've done for many years. Those kids, nobody listens or sees them as people. They see them as a punk or as a criminal. They're extremely marginalized. A lot of them are kids of color, because honestly, kids of color are usually get marginalized even further through the system. And this is a way where they say, I can talk about what happened to me. I can talk about my experience growing up, good, bad, and indifferent. I can talk about what happened to me and what it feels like to be here in this place without judgment. And there's a real power in that, not only for the kids with one another, but also for the teachers and the guards that are in there listening to their stories. They suddenly, all of a sudden, they're not a number and they're not like a statistic. They become a human being.
You're making me think of objectification when we treat people like objects instead of having that heart-to-heart connection. And I do think, storytelling is so powerful for that reason, because it gives us a chance to understand and to put ourselves in the shoes of the other. And of course, that idea of other is underlying so many of the conflicts that we see in the world today, and the incapacity of each of us to imagine ourselves in that, coming from the perspective of that other, whatever that is to us. So that's really powerful. Thank you. Does anybody else want to say something, or shall I read this?
Well, on that note, I belong to 12-step group, and I sometimes tell people it's the most step psychological experience I've ever had, because here you have people, I think we're all marginalized, most of us just don't know it, but here you have people who have been pushed into the depths of despair, and they come together and start telling stories and telling the truth, maybe for the first time in their lives, and the healing and the I've taken people with me who don't need recovery, and they'll come out of it inevitably and say, that is the most amazing experience I've ever been through. And nobody ever uses the word depth psychology. And Carl Jung is mentioned in the big book, in his correspondence with Bill Wilson. One of the founders, really, of Alcoholics Anonymous was in therapy with Jung for a year. And Jung wrote and said, I couldn't help him. I told him he needed to go have a spiritual experience, which is the goal of the 12-step work. If you follow the 12 steps, it promises a spiritual experience. So I think, and Scott Peck said that, Alcoholics Anonymous may save the world, because it's the one place where people can go for the first time and really tell their stories.
Yeah, wow.
It seems like this conversation is really, or the kind of associations to it are really kind of hovering around organic narrative. Craig's reference to Jung's statement about symbol versus sign, I think, comes from approaching the unconscious, where Jung is trying to give a narrative that people, common, depth psychology educated people can understand. That was one of the purposes of that book. And I think that that's kind of the struggle that depth psychology has, if it's kind of moving into the second half of life sort of metaphor, is to come up with or to find the language that is fitting for these things. And we have some clues from this conversation that the narrative has to be organic to the person. And so long as someone is giving of their own story, that automatically has soul in it. I think that trumps language. Like when James Hillman talked about language and needing a new language, he was thinking in a Greek way, I suspect, which means what is fitting, the kind of communication modality that's fitting. If the accent is not said differently on language, it's not on words. That's kind of a literalism. So, and this kind of reminds me of the event that happened recently and all of the things that happen around those sorts of events where an organic narrative is shut down in the service of labeling, which is really what's happening. Anytime there's an event like this, they are mentally ill, a psychopath, a racist. The list goes on, and it's not just relevant to this event. There are countless events where you slap a label on it and it shuts down the narrative. What's the cultural narrative? What's the narrative of the individual? And that's not to understand someone's narrative and to understand soul does not necessarily exonerate or say someone doesn't need to be responsible or we just need to understand a story. But it adds, if we just slap a label on something, it becomes decontextualized, as if the thing happens ex nihilo, out of nothing. And it's until we really understand the narrative of soul, especially without a non-dominant narrative hovering above it and crushing it, do we really understand why these things happen? Who is the person and what is the context? And I think it's relative even outside of catastrophic situation. That's just human life, you know. Who am I? What is the context? What does it mean? So,
yeah, I agree.
It seems like narrative has a lot to do with this in soul, I think.
Yeah, and the thing that happens in the popular public narrative is that it becomes the narrative of the perpetrator instead of the narrative of the victims. I mean, I've seen like maybe one shot of a victim telling the story and 100 shots of this guy, and no one. What I want to hear about, what I want to see, is the families and the people who need to be loved and comforted, not the people who are going, not someone who's going to be an icon for the next guy who picks up a gun. But another thing I wanted to add to this is the, and it's related to what you're saying, Brent. It's just that, and this is another aspect of what depth psychology is, and that what it is what it's been is a response to the crisis of modernity. And there's been it's something that's emerged. It gets back to being the natural thing. It's something that's emerged out of culture through Jung and others, because there's a need, and because we've lost what Peter Berger called the sacred canopy. We've lost a place where we can go that relativizes the ego and allows us to draw on another center of the organism, and likewise another center of the culture. And what's new, and this is how it relates to what you're saying, Brent, is what's new is that in the past, the way we did that, the way we got in touch with the way we relativized the ego and got in touch with the great other, the sacred other, was in groups, through institutions, and through religious practice. And the big crisis now is that it's all individual. We have to find an individual story. This is why what you're saying about stories being so important. We need to find an individual way to do this, and this is a lonely prospect, and it's a very unusual prospect. And here we are all talking about it, trying to get a group way to do an individual work. And I think that's one of the difficulties and the challenges of depth psychology, is addressing a group need individually and coming together and sharing our individual, as Donna's saying, the individual stories.
Oh, Eva, you're muted. Hold on, I think it's on my end. Thank you. Go ahead.
Listening to a fascinating discussion, and just for the sake of time, I wanted to bring in the other piece, and that we are holding a positive side as well. I mean, this is what happened. The tragedy happened the same day that the Pope spoke out, and he spoke out around about inequality on the planet, and he spoke out about climate change and the crisis that we're in. And so much of what we're seeing is also reaction to that. So that was a really positive step. And so it's juxtaposed paradoxically against this tragedy. And of course, there are many other tragedies going on simultaneously across the world, not just what happened here in the United States. This is happening on a daily basis. And we are the perpetrators as Americans in many ways, in many places. But I think that the Pope coming out and speaking to this was so powerful and so positive. And the reactions that I noted from it was also coincided with the beginning of the Republican, the Republicans coming, the beginning of their, what is it? Their
convention?
Campaigns.
Campaign, thank you, that's the word. Their campaign. And listening to Jeb Bush, this how uncomfortable he was that the Pope was entering into politics so far. So-called politics, and was so striking to me. It's like we, on the other hand, here in the United States, are bringing religion into our political system, and maybe we've transcended, as Brent was saying, all of these labels, and we need to move back into the trajectory and our destiny of coming back as humanity. By bringing it all together, honoring each other. But I think that the Pope's coming out at this particular moment in time is a huge potential for the positive right now, for what may emerge, and I don't think there's an accident. I think in this extraordinary synchronicity, the paradox of these two seemingly opposing things coming together. I mean, this is that holding that tension of the opposite. So perhaps we're being called to both look at our shadow and also look at our potential as human beings.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Let's go to a couple of questions here. I know, Eva, you're reminding me, we allocated 90 minutes for this. It goes so quickly, but this is an amazing discussion, and I just, again, want to thank everybody. Let's go to Hadley. You've had your hand up for a while. Would you still like to say something? I'm unmuting you now. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Bonnie. Yes, I want to, the synchronicity with what Eva just said. Yes. Can you hear me okay? Okay, the synchronicity with what Eva just said has been boiling in me through this whole discussion. It's what the horror of the massacre in Charleston is so evident, it's so vivid, it's so obviously abhorrent. The horror of what's being done to the earth has, as we know, it's been quote unquote normalized. And I'm struck by the synchronicity of this terrible massacre taking place the day before the release of the Pope's encyclical on the environment. And I just want to run a quick quote from the early piece of that encyclical, because I couldn't help thinking that depth psychologists come in many guises. And I say that as a very long retired Catholic. The Pope said, "This sister," speaking about the earth, he said, "this sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made of her elements. We breathe her air with, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. Nothing in this world is indifferent to us." And that's the close of the quote there. But I couldn't help noticing that all of the people who were murdered have skin the color of the earth. And I can't help noticing that the agonizing story about these obvious murders seems to have almost buried the story about Pope Francis's agonizing recognition of the murder of the earth. Yes. So that's what I just wanted to note here. It just, I was so struck by it astrologically. I was struck by, looking at the untimed birth chart of this man who did this, and all of that. There's just the timing of these two things coming together. I think there's quite a lot in that somehow.
Hadley, I'm very moved by what you just read, and I think this is Pope Francis is speaking for the feminine, and I mean, so much of what we're experiencing is this world out of balance as the patriarchy is going down. I mean, I think many of us who have lived a while have seen that this was going to happen, and that it wasn't going to be graceful demise. And the earth is responding.
Yes.
And so I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. And that encyclical is about 150 some odd pages long. And I think, you know, and again, I've got my own bias as a retired Catholic about, but my God, that the Pope came to this is just so wonderful. And you know, speaking of patriarchal system, I used to run groups for recovering Catholic women, and I said, you know, we grew up in a completely patriarchal system that we called Holy Mother Church, run by men who wear dresses, and so there's a lot of paradox in that. So perhaps, you know, something is turning here, but again, it got buried. It pretty much got buried,
and it's no accident that it got buried. And you know, because of course we have Fox News, we have this incredible propaganda system in the United States. And this was something I recently went to Ireland, and this was something that was really evident in Ireland, that our news is very different from the news they're getting in Europe and other parts of the world.
Yes.
I mean, yes. So.
So and it very much speaks to what Brent said about the organic narrative is shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, here's what it is. I mean, obviously crazy. He's obviously, I mean, look at him. He's crazy, and another crazy person with a gun, you know, and that solves it. And so anyway, that's my piece. So anyway, thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.
And thank you, Eva. Yeah.
Bonnie, when you read that quotation at the beginning of our conversation today, what struck me on the topic that we're talking about now is how Jung seems to have been saying, you know, instead of natural disasters, we now face the disasters of the psyche, but actually we now face both because of the psyche, which had he lived longer he would have seen too, you know. And there's actually, I think there's actually hints of that in the Red Book as well. Philemon castigating Jung's ancestors, I think they were, and so on, about their ecological behavior. So it's all these big issues with the psyche in the center.
Yeah, good point. Very, very good observation. Yeah. So I wonder how do we deal with that? Again, there's so many great comments and questions coming in here. We'll never get to all of them, but I just want to sort of read through a few. And what we'll do is we'll share these on the Alliance, these questions, all of them that were submitted here are comments, so that everybody can see them, even if we don't get around to talking them today. But Lara, for example, is asking, can depth psychology come up with very basic 10 principles that covers the core of how to address the psyche and the unconscious, from individuals and the collective being the main concept, and then building on that? And she's talking about how language has become privatized. Go ahead, Craig.
I hear Hillman groaning somewhere.
What they were hearing had left out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another comment was made, and I'm sorry, I forgot who made that. I'll find it. But somebody was asking about what, you know, how can the stories of the shooting come forward in kind of that organic narrative without focusing on, you know, victimization and turning these into the victims. So how can we maintain that balance and that circle of health on some level with through the storytelling? And is there a way to do that? And by the way, you guys, I think what we should do is start a dedicated group on the Alliance, a written forum, where we can talk about all of these things as a community. You know, it can be done in the general page, but I think it'd be nice to sort of put all of those into one place so that everybody who's interested in continuing this conversation and asking these questions can go there and keep the conversation going in between these live events that we host. And I also think, by the way, while I'm thinking about it, and then I want to go to another question, is it would be really great to do some storytelling events here via the Alliance in just a format exactly like this, where people can come and tell their stories, like Donna was talking about, And we can get to know people, we can connect with people, we can talk about really important events and have these stories come forward and connect us. That might be one way that depth psychology can, the voice can begin to come forward in more of an activist kind of way. And when I say activist, I guess I mean activity. It's that movement we were talking about where something is actually happening, where we're not just sitting around in our ivory towers talking about it, because there's a lot of that goes on, and I'm sure I'm guilty of it on a number of levels, and those of us who are in academia are kind of steeped in that on some level. So so we really just want to start something here, a real powerful conversation about what can be done next. Let's go to another question. A couple of people have their hand up. Shirley, you've had your hand up for a long time, and then Lara, I see you have yours up. So let's go to Shirley first, and then we'll go to Lara after that. Shirley, go ahead. You're unmuted. Shirley, are you there? Okay, she's had her hand up for a long time. She may not be prepared, or I'm not sure if the mic is working. So let's go to Lara. Hold on 1 second, Lara. Okay, go ahead.
Well, hello. I'm honored to be part of this discussion. I truly think this is quite a daunting task you guys have taken on, considering the depth of the psyche. And so my hat goes off to the work that you guys are doing. And I feel that a couple of things came to me. One was, being a Jungian over 30 years, is Jung himself said it took 2,000 years for humanity to come out of barbarism. And there is an element here that we do need to simplify if we are wanting to go on a larger scale to the public, to educate them about the psyche, which is a difficult task as it is, because there's a mystery involved here. We don't know. He himself said it, Jung himself said, we don't know why the intelligence, as we know what to do that's right, that we still fail, in overcoming it. There is a mystery to the psyche that we do not understand why these things are happening the way they are. That doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to address what comes up as metaphors and what archetypal things that are hitting the culture, let alone the complex of the culture. The issue I'm experiencing in the discussions is the lack of framing and simplifying as to what is depth psychology truly have as a vision, as to put it out to only to the professionals to educate ourselves and simplify the language of it, or do we really as a group want to go to the public? These are two separate concepts that really needs to be framed properly so the time could be utilized effectively, because no one has the time nor the energy nowadays because of the speed of what's going on and the challenges that we're all facing. So distilling it, when I said it earlier, I wasn't trying to be compared to Hillman or anybody. What I'm noticing that it's coming my way, my practice, is what I've been doing is always trying to bring the simplicity to the event of today, what we're facing today, just today. We don't really have the power on the future because we have no idea what could be happening, 5 minutes from now to us. So distilling it, what I'm trying to say, language is very privatized. The more we come together as professionals, in-depth psychology, being with the Jungian ideas being behind it, to bring it to the here and now, to know how for us to dialogue, how effectively we can go to the media and say, please, discuss the background of this individual, how disturbed they were as an individual. My husband just read something on the Drudge Report that there were these medications that are being given to these kids, and how it's making them take on our cultural complex and taking it upon themselves because they just got swallowed up into the collective unconscious and took it upon themselves to go do something about it. Yes. The media isn't portraying effectively the illness of the individual and how they're suffering through this cultural complex. And instead, of simplifying it, they're going all over the place. And it's so confusing, it shuts people down.
Yes.
So if we're going to discuss something, what I'm saying is I'm really honored to be part of this group because I do want to be a voice. I'm dealing with college students too. And they really, really do want to have a future, which is pretty much what I was told when I was graduating. Good luck in the unemployment lines. But I still managed to get a job in my own field because I didn't believe the media putting out this negative information toward the individual path. So we could be a voice to that, is what I'm trying to say. In differentiating that your individuality, it does matter, which is what Jung said. It's the individual that makes the masses. So the more we touch individuals and distill the thing for them to become conscious about the unconscious, I think we're going to get somewhere. And thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Lara.
And thank you. I wanted to respond to that, Lara, and that how important it is. That is depth psychology, bringing psychology back into the culture, because we really don't have psychology. No. And so that's a very, very important point. Bringing psychology back into the culture, back in the teaching people what psychology is. And part of what it is, of course, the ability to self-reflect and to develop our individuality and a sense of being seen and heard. And we are, of course, our family structures have broken down, and people are lost. And
I do agree, by the way, with James Newell, for example, reflecting on the past. Okay, in our seminars, in the stress management, one of the things we were doing is we were always taking what happened in the past, where are you now, and where you're going. And as a way of gaining the wisdom, which is what Jungians did in San Francisco here, Odysseus, journey of how the shipwreck, and what do you do with the shipwreck? You take the wisdom. You try to tell people, grab the wisdom from the past. But let's look at what we can do right now, and I personally, feel very, very adamant about this, simplifying it, whether to among us as professionals, coming into a language that we can be effective in putting it out. So we can, imagine if all 4,000 members of Depth Psychology got on the line. It doesn't matter where you were. I would get up in the middle of the night if I were to sit with all of you and do a meditation in putting out something positive to the psyche. But I don't think we really can control the mystery of why these things are going on in the transition the civilization is in, because Jung himself said it. We don't know why the psyche does not grab on and change as quickly as we want it to, because we all want to come to peace, but we don't know why it's not getting there with all the intelligence that's out.
Yeah.
Are we not, though? I mean, if we are not understanding metaphor, are we not concretizing what's happening in the psyche?
Yeah, I was just thinking, what we're talking about here is soul. I mean, we're saying the world is lacking psychology. Well, the world is lacking soul. Or it's not that it's lacking, it's just that we aren't allowing it to exist on some level. We're blocking it. And what is soul but imagination, which is Hillman's term as well. Soul is the imagination. Brent, you were going to say something, I think. Thank you so much, Lara.
Well, part of this, that's like an awesome, what she said. Part of the slippery work of soul is it's not that we need to invent something and then transmit that information to someone else. It's more like soul is always already present, and it's a way of cultivating, bringing out, encouraging, coaching along, or even simply affording a space for such a thing to occur to begin with would be the kind of correct action to take. As opposed to a kind of action that has a certain proclivity or addiction to certitude. I mean, when asked what the highest action humanity can take in the face of all of this destructiveness these days, Heidegger said meditative thinking, which is openness to mystery and releasement to the things themselves. And everyone thought, after his complaints about the technological attitude and the destruction of the earth, that he would say, we need to take action and we need to, but he said, we need to just open a space before such a thing is even possible. That has to do, as the last person said, with a mystery. And the person who isn't discussed a lot in depth psychology, who I kind of like, I guess, is Wilfred Bion, who said that the psychoanalytic attitude is F and O was his notation. Faith in O, which is unknown and unknowable processes. Faith in the mystery does not mean religious faith. But he treated faith as a phenomenon unto itself that was inextricably linked with a hope or an opening of a space that moved beyond the technocratic attitude these days.
Yeah. Oh, you guys, so much rich discussion and so much more to come. So we are at the time where we need to wrap up, and I just wanted to thank everybody so much for your participation, to all of our panelists, to all of the board members. We only have 6 camera slots available via this software, so unfortunately we don't see everybody's faces here, but we did have a chance to see almost everybody. So thanks to those who are not on camera. On camera we have James Newell, Craig Chalquist, Brent Potter, Michael Bogar, Donna May, myself, Bonnie Bright, and then off camera right now we have Eva Ryder, Gary Bobroff, and Jesse Masterson. And am I missing someone? I think that's it. And then we had a couple of members who couldn't attend today because they had other commitments. Dorene Mahoney and also Mark Sipowicz are not with us today. But we have an amazing board. I just want to say I really love this group. I think we have really, we all have a huge commitment to this exact conversation and to really, what is it that we're doing here, and what is the role of depth psychology? Depth Psychology Alliance was created to further this work on some level, and it's going through its own evolution, but we are all dedicated to this, and we're looking at what needs to happen moving forward. I think Lara's point about having a language and conversation for people who are outside on the streets, as we have been talking about it, and also within the field who are practitioners and or educators, those might be 2 different things, and it's important to discuss those. Again, everybody had so many questions that wrote in. Thank you so much to everybody who was on the chat, and you guys can go read that. Thank you for the questions. I will post those questions somewhere online so that everybody can go read those, and hopefully we can continue the discussion offline. We will be doing another one of these.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, James.
Is there truth to the rumor that that there may be changes with the Depth Psychology Alliance?
Thank you. You're reading my mind. Thank you. Yes, we've been talking a lot about what is the right thing for both Depth Psychology Alliance as well as, again, the field or the movement, if you want to look at it that way, of depth psychology. And as a board, we feel that the Alliance has been private for a long time, meaning that currently you have to be a member in order to see what's actually happening on the Alliance, and definitely in order to post. And so we are actually putting into process a plan which will allow us to take the Alliance public, in the sense that it will be open for others to be able to see and follow the conversations and the videos and the events and everything that is offered via Depth Psychology Alliance. So that's a huge change. That will do a number of things which are very powerful in our minds, and I'll just wrap this up in the next 60 seconds. But really quickly, I just wanted to let you know, it will allow anything that is posted on the Alliance to be shared if you want it to be shared on, for example, Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, other social media. There's so much value in the way that social media is developing these days, in the way that it can reach out and get to people who maybe have never heard of depth psychology before, and who are just waiting for the opportunity to come to them. And so there will be a way for us to protect some of the content, but I wanted to encourage everybody to start looking. If you've contributed things, if there's things that you don't want to be made public, start thinking about that. It's definitely an option to delete those things before we go public. We haven't set a date yet. We will be working on that. We have a task force dedicated to how that might happen and what that date will be, and we'll be updating everybody about that. But it's a huge step in our minds about how we can actually start bringing this more to the streets and making it more available and more accessible. And these kinds of conversations that we're having here need to be happening out in the open. I mean, this is, anybody could join this who wanted to, and we have several dozen people on here, but it should be 500 people on here, in my opinion. And also, by the way, in closing, I will just say, I haven't seen any posts about the shooting on the Alliance. other than within our sort of group, this group that we were talking offline about it all week. But in the general forum, nobody's posted about it. And yet when I go to Facebook, half of the posts there are about it. And so this will give us a way to integrate that so that if you post something on the Alliance or a blog or a comment or something, that people will also be able to see it elsewhere. So there will be more interaction. They won't get stumped by having to be a member of the Alliance in order to actually see what's going on there. They will still have to be a member in order to post. So we will protect ourselves there. But anyway, so a lot of talking about that. You'll hear more about that. If you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to us. I just wanted to encourage everybody, please feel free to message any one of us via the Alliance. You can just look, search for us in the search function and find us, or you can also email us at board@depthpsychalliance.com. Not Depth Psychology Alliance, but depthpsychalliance.com. And we'll get those emails and we can respond to you that way as well. But again, just encourage everyone to post, share, express your thoughts. This can be a conversation if nobody's in it. So I just really hope that we can extend the amazing experience that I feel from today back into the community as we move forward. And we'll do more of these as we go as well. So anyone have anything they'd like to add before we go? All right.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Yeah,
thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for everybody who attended and who's listening later. And we'll see each other again very soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Cheers.